What happens when a child experiences trauma? It depends. First, what might be considered a trauma for a child? Some of those might be having to stay at a hospital alone, being in a car wreck, losing a close loved one, witnessing violence in the home or the community on a regular basis, having a parent with unmanaged depression or potentially mental illness, and that's unmanaged, having a parent who abuses substances regularly, experiencing separation from a parent, parental incarceration, experiencing child physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, experiencing physical or emotional neglect. Those are all common traumatic events that are seen in children. When a trauma starts is important. If it starts in infancy or early childhood and continues over time, the impact on the brain is much greater than if it starts later, just because of how fast the brain is developing during those first few years of life. In that sort of situation, the damage to the brain is likely to be greater, particularly if a child does not have an adult to sort of buffer the stress for the child. If trauma begins or happens to a child during the school age years, after the child's basic wiring of the brain is developed, the outcomes are likely to be better, even though if it continues over time without the buffering support of an adult, then the impact will increase as well. When trauma begins in the school age years, we're more likely to see impacts to school learning, school success, as well as social relationships with other people. We may also see more acting out when trauma happens for the first time during the school age years. And if a child experiences trauma within a context of loving parents or other adults who are there to buffer that impact, they'll still be impacted, but they'll get through it much better. If there are not parents or other adults buffering the impact of the trauma, whatever brain development is happening at that point in time will be affected. And kids' interactions with others can be impacted as well, depending on the severity of the trauma. Typically, what happens with trauma in the absence of supportive adults is that the lower level brain begins to take over to ensure survival. In that case, the amygdala, or what we call the fear center of the brain, the reptilian brain, begins to be stimulated due to the danger for the child. If the trauma is a one-time trauma, the amygdala will probably begin to rest again unless the child begins to have reminders of that trauma. If it's an ongoing trauma, the amygdala will likely continue to fire, increasing the likelihood that the amygdala becomes the go-to center of the brain, so that when a child has an interaction with others, the amygdala begins to fire to try to keep the child safe, because the brain does not feel safe because they've become used to ongoing trauma and having to be on high alert. If you remember, the more a part of the brain is being used, the more likely it is to continue to be used. So in this situation, we have to help a child begin to feel safe so that we can rest the amygdala and so that they can continue on in activities that their brain is supposed to be focused on, like learning at school, engaging with their peers in social interactions. Other impacts to the brain with trauma during this age include impacts to learning, memory, and executive function skills, like that ability to focus, pay attention, plan, make decisions, impulse control, and problem solving. And that's because of damage to the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus due to ongoing stress hormone secretion. Kids may also become very sensitive to emotional stimuli and be quick to interpret facial expressions as angry or dangerous when they are experiencing a lot of trauma during this particular time point. These kids often have a smaller ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for emotional processing of social information. And finally, kids' ability to inhibit responses And therefore, their ability to display self-regulation can be impacted due to damage to the prefrontal cortex during this point in time as well, if a trauma happens during these school age years. And then because of the stress that kids experience due to the trauma, if there's not an adult there to buffer the impact of the trauma, then their sleep and other factors like their appetite and even their desire to engage interactions with other people can be impacted. So what can we do to support kids who have experienced trauma? The most important thing we can do is to help them understand that they're safe, or take steps to ensure their safety if they are not safe, and let them then begin to understand that they're safe. They can't thrive if they have to worry about their safety. Their brains can't rest. And as we've seen, this has impacts in every area of functioning for a child. A second step is that the important adults in their lives should pay particular attention to their own self-regulation and be sure that they are supporting their child's regulation rather than create ongoing dysregulation through negative interactions. The biggest thing that we as adults can do is manage our own emotions, because kids regulate their emotions through us. Kids don't automatically know how to handle strong emotions, and they need support and learning strategies for dealing with those strong emotions that arise. You know, that might be through breathing, through mindfulness activities, through beginning to get a handle on their own ability to focus. And when they're able to control their breathing, then that's one step to calming the brain. We can also ensure having daily routines to support healing, because kids, when they have a predictable environment, they have an additional layer of safety because they know what to expect. And kids who have experienced trauma have an additional need to feel control over their environment. When we provide that predictable schedule for them, or, just knowing what's coming first and then next and then last, then we support their ability to control the environment. And then we also want to let them know that the important adults in their lives are there to keep them safe and can talk to them about what they've experienced, what's happened. As adults, we can validate and normalize their feelings, whatever they are, normalize their responses to the trauma. However, we don't have to validate the behavior. And this is where there's a difference. We can validate feelings all day long, and then we can help kids develop strategies for what to do to manage their behavior. We want to help them feel heard, understood, and supported, while also discussing appropriate behavioral responses. We can also help kids to understand the link between the trauma and their brain's response, that their brain can be compromised behaviorally, emotionally, and cognitively. And we should help them develop strategies for how to deal with these impacts, like taking a deep breath before they react to a situation, counting to 10, and then responding, thinking to themselves, I'm feeling upset because I'm reminded of this thing that happened. I need to calm myself down. And then we should continue to deepen the important connections and relationships for children so they can heal in that environment of safety.